in 2018. He writes regularly for the London Review of Books and The Guardian, and it's a particular pleasure that I was able to wrangle him into this event, because I think he's just one of the most percipient untanglers of the particular political state we're in at the moment, and he's written really beautifully about populism and the kind of decline of liberalism. So I really hope that without making too many artificial connections, we are going to make some really intriguing connections between the ancient world and the politics of today. So what we want to think about is populism a useful lens through which to consider the first century CE Roman Emperor Nero? Can we learn anything fresh about Nero by thinking about him as a populist? And in fact, can we learn anything about our own times, since we live in a populist moment politically, with populist politicians and movements on the rise around the world, have been for a few years now, from Trump to Podemos to Johnson to Corbyn. These figures and movements have recently loomed large in our contemporary politics. So I think in considering the question of Nero and populism, we have to acknowledge that we're dealing with several layers of understanding. On the one hand, we have the kind of received Nero from the ancient historians Tacitus and Suetonius. Nero the dissolute, Nero the megalomaniac, the murderous, and of course this Nero, as brought down to us from these sources, has been magnified and made more and more lurid as the centuries go on. Nero, the killer of Christians, Nero, the fiddler while Rome burns. Then there's, I suppose, another layer, arguably, or the potentially irrecoverable real Nero that lurks behind those sources, and perhaps, you know, this is where the material culture that we see in the exhibition comes in. Particularly maybe offering perhaps a different view. And finally, of course, I think we shouldn't be blind to the final layer of the reason it's very tempting to frame Nero as a populist is to do with our own particular moment. We wouldn't necessarily have been framing Nero as a populist or thinking about populism in relation to Nero 20, 30 or 40 years ago. So there's a lot to consider here, and I'm very excited to ask our panel to start thinking about these questions. But the first thing I want to do is to ask Tom, who's written so brilliantly about the lives of the Julio-Claudian emperors, to kick off by giving us the story. I mean, in a way, the kind of unexpurgated, lurid, brilliant kind of story of the Emperor Nero, just so that we can be reminded of what we're dealing with here. Tom.
So Charlotte, the subtitle of this show is The Man Behind the Myth, and I'm going to give you the myth. So the myth is Nero is born to two monstrous parents. The father is from a distinguished aristocratic family, the Domitii. He is the kind of guy who runs over a small child in his chariot and thinks absolutely nothing of it. His wife, Agrippina, is descended from Augustus, but more saliently is the sister of the Emperor Caligula, who, of course, is another byword for depravity. When Nero is born, his father looks at the baby and says that no good can come of any child born of me and Agrippina. And so it proves. Agrippina ends up married to her uncle, Claudius, who has a younger son, a son who is younger than Nero. Agrippina is keen to get this boy out of the way and Claudius, so she poisons Claudius. Nero becomes emperor shortly after he gets rid of Claudius's son, Britannicus. He is then tutored by, essentially he's under the thumb of Agrippina, who is an absolutely terrifying virago. He is tutored by Seneca, the great philosopher, and for about 5 years, he's essentially kept in check. He's kind of late teens when he becomes emperor, into his early 20s. Then he decides he's had enough of it. He essentially kind of slightly elbows Seneca aside, and he has Agrippina murdered. He does this in a variety. He essentially kind of wacky racist type kind of contraptions. First of all, he tries to destroy her in a room that collapses. That doesn't work. Then he tries to drown her on a ship that collapses. That doesn't work. So he sends a death squad and they stab her through her womb after she has pointed to it and said, "Stab this that gave birth to such a monster." From this point on, there's nothing to hold him back. He takes to the stage, absolutely shocking in a society where actors are viewed as absolutely the lowest of the low. He performs on the lyre. He then decides that he'd like to burn down Rome so that he can build himself an enormous palace in the middle of the city. Having done that, he then crushes a conspiracy against him in which Seneca had been involved. He orders Seneca to commit suicide. Simultaneously, I forgot to mention furthermore that he'd been married to Claudius's daughter. He has got rid of her, had her executed, and replaced her with the great love of his life, Poppaea Sabina, who is the most beautiful woman in Rome. Shocking, scandalous, says, "Hope I die before I get old." She does die before she gets old because Nero kicks her to death after she, heavily pregnant, nags him when he's come back late from the races. He is distraught by this, so he does the obvious thing. What would you do if you're missing the wife that you just kicked to death? Obviously, you look around for someone to replace her who looks exactly like her. Nero finds it in the shape not of a girl, but of a boy who he castrates and then nicknames Sporus, Greek for sperm. It's a kind of amusing joke. But aside from that, Sporus becomes Poppaea Sabina. Nero then takes Poppaea Sabina, stroke Sporus, with him to Greece, where he competes in the Olympics. It's all completely rigged. He wins first prize despite having crashed his chariot. He comes back. By this point, everyone's fed up with him. There's a rebellion. Nero loses his support. He runs away to a villa. There he gets cornered. He says, "What an artist, dies with me," and he commits suicide.
That was absolutely brilliant, Tom. Thank you very much indeed. So that, as you say, that's the myth.
Before Catherine comes in, can I just say that is the myth?
Yeah. But actually, first, I kind of want to ask.
Can I just, Charlotte? Also, just to add, I missed out a crucial aspect of his subsequent notoriety in the myth, which is that he blames the Great Fire of Rome on the Christians, and he will be commemorated in the book of Revelation faithfully as the beast. The number of the beast, according to numeric calculations, comes to mean Nero. And so Nero's reputation derives from Roman writers who have every reason to mistrust him, and Christian writers who likewise commemorate him as this kind of almost literally demonic figure. He is the emperor who presides over Babylon, which is Rome.
It's a remarkable story, and it's, of course, we love it, and it's really hard to detach ourselves from this kind of the sheer appallingness of this narrative. But I think the second building brick, and I think we're going to connect everything up when Catherine comes in a minute, but the second building brick, I think, for me, is really to get a handle on, what populism actually is, because it feels to me like there are a lot of different populisms in contemporary politics. Some just really don't look like others. There are the sort of populisms of the left, there are populisms of the right, there are nationalist populisms, and I would love you, Will, to kind of help us with that.
Sure. I mean, it is a term that is quite confusing. It's around a lot at the moment, and I think one of the immediate ambivalences of the term is that it gets used both to denounce people as undemocratic when they're accused of being kind of proto-fascist or this sort of thing, but at the same time, it also makes this kind of rhetorical appeal to the people and to moments of democratic uprising. So it's unclear often exactly where populism stands in relation to democracy as we understand it in the modern world. I think there's a textbook definition of populism, which is that it is a style of rhetoric more than anything else, but also, I suppose, a style of leadership, which makes moral distinctions between a group of people who are perceived as morally pure and ordinary and decent, and they are the people in some sense. So whenever you hear someone like Nigel Farage talking about sort of the people, good ordinary people, he's got a certain kind of type of person in mind. I mean, there's millions of them, but there's a certain sort of image of who the people are, and they are distinguished from a second group who are known as the elite. And this is obviously a kind of a modern vocabulary, but this rhetorical move of drawing this moral line between those who are ordinary and morally pure on the one side and those who are elite and corrupt on the other side is the kind of central characteristic of all populisms within the analysis of political science and political theory. There are, as you suggested, left-wing versions of this rhetorical move, so that if, for instance, Jeremy Corbyn or Podemos or Bernie Sanders says that the 1% have rigged the economy against kind of ordinary people, that is a kind of left populist move because it's drawing this rhetorical and moralized distinction. It's not simply saying, like Marxists do, that capitalism is sort of structurally organized around exploitation. It's actually saying that one small group has actually ripped off the much larger group. Equally, and I suppose more prevalently at the moment, there is a right-wing populism, and often when people use the term populism, they're talking about the right and they're talking about nationalists, where it's very often the elite is very often distinguished as a cultural elite, and that their crime, their sort of moral deviance, is to be disloyal in cultural terms to the nation, and that cultural elite may involve judges, it may involve academics, it may involve now in the kind of culture wars around museums, curators, or there are all sorts of people that might be sort of lumped into this elite. But their distinguishing characteristic from the right is that they exhibit disloyalty to the ordinary people who make up the nation. So it's that dividing line between these two groups that is so key. I just want to identify just a couple of other things if I can, in case this is helpful. I think one thing to say is that first of all, of course, you can think of combinations of these of left and right, and there are various examples of that in Europe, in various countries at the moment. But I think that one thing I think this may be relevant to somehow we come back to the topic of Nero and perhaps in his relationships to the Senate, is that what this tends to involve in not just in democratic societies, but in constitutionally organized polities more generally, is a type of leader who stands up and targets the rest of the political system in some sense, so that you might, around something like, particularly Brexit did this heavily to the United Kingdom, where effectively those who were positioning themselves as the defenders of Brexit and the kind of saviors of Brexit were blaming the House of Commons as being the enemy, those who'd betrayed Brexit. There was Boris Johnson used that phrase that was very, very controversial, the surrender bill, that he kept using it as being this claim that the MPs did not represent the people and that he did represent the people. And it's that claim that on some level the institutions which purport to act in the public good, which might be Parliament, it might be law, it might be the Senate, it might be all sorts of institutions that purport to act in public good, are actually lying to you, that they are fake in some sense. This is obviously something that Trump accused CNN and the New York Times of being fake news media, that they are acting in their own interests. Meanwhile, I, as the great leader, have some kind of direct relationship to this morally pure people, and that through my body, through my performances, through my self, can act in the interests of the people in a way that all of these sort of constitutionally and legally sort of mandated procedures are actually just a kind of sort of rigged game that are sort of cheating the people of the inheritance that is naturally theirs. And that then leads to, and this is my final point, I mean, that then poses the question, who is qualified to be such a leader? Because there's an immediate paradox where on the one hand, they have to position themselves as a kind of outsider, where they have to be able to say, I'm not part of that elite. I'm not part of that sort of internal system of people looking after themselves, all the kind of, liberals and all of these sort of lawyers and parliamentarians. And on the other hand, they obviously have to have quite a lot of power and quite a lot of recognition in order to be able to do this at all. And this is where I think the very concept of celebrity becomes very interesting, because figures who have celebrity, whether as business people like Donald Trump, whether as people who have a sort of face that is known via the television for some reason, but, you know, we haven't got onto the beyond the myth yet in relation to Nero, but it's interesting that, as Tom was talking about, a politician who takes to the stage, because of course it's in the arts, it's in the cultural industries, it's in the media, which offers the opportunity for someone to both sort of square that circle, on the one hand of being able to position themselves as an outsider to the political system, but on the other hand to attain sufficient recognition and power that they are able to somehow kind of, as I say, kind of walk that rather paradoxical line.
Of course, and of course, Trump was, aside from being a famous businessman, was of course the star of reality.
Exactly, it was a reality TV show, and I think in some ways reality television is the sort of perfect sort of space for this type of political performance in the current world, obviously.
Yeah, fascinating, Catherine. I just going to quote from the introduction to the exhibition catalogue, Torsten Opper's brilliant introduction to the Nero exhibition catalogue, and he talks about, essentially, he describes what the account that Tom has just sort of précised beautifully for us, which was a sort of a Tacitian, Suetonian account of Nero. He says, this myth was very deliberately and artfully created by a group of elite Roman writers already in the half century or so after Nero's death through enforced suicide in June AD 68, and it has been accepted almost unchallenged until relatively recently. So, you know, Catherine, can you give us a sense here of how far, I mean, in a sense, you agree with that? I mean, you know, is the account that Tom has given us the sort of, you know, the ancient equivalent of Guardian and FT leader writers railing against Johnson and being the only thing that's left? I mean, is that the anti-populist, anti-Neronian point of view, completely kind of abstracted from reality? Is it just a sort of smear job by Nero's elite opponents, or how would you characterize that so-called myth?
Well, I think in some respects it obviously is a smear job, and one thing that's really important to remember about Nero is that, as Tom has vividly described, he comes to a horrible end. He's the last member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, so the people who come after him want to distance themselves as radically as possible from Nero. So, you know, whereas previous emperors had been succeeded by other members of their own family who had a vested interest in kind of their legitimacy, Nero, by contrast, is succeeded by people who want to diss him absolutely. So, and we get, you know, a very strong flavour of that. I mean, the Flavian emperors who eventually emerged victorious in the form of Vespasian after all the civil wars of the year 68, they're clearly, you know, very focused on portraying Nero as completely beyond the pale, because actually their claim to, you know, Vespasian's claim to being emperor is extremely flimsy. He's just won in a civil war. He's got no family connection with Augustus. So, you know, his best chance is to bang on about how terrible Nero was and how he himself embodies traditional old-fashioned Roman values, and particularly old-fashioned Roman military values. Vespasian's a terribly successful general. Now, in fact, the Flavians do all kinds of rather populist things, but they're kind of, you know, they've clearly got every reason to portray Nero as in as bad a light as possible. And I mean, you know, so, and that Flavian tradition is manifest clearly in Suetonius's biography, in Tacitus's account of the period, and also in things like Martial's epigrams written under the Flavians. You might come back to some of those later. So yes, obviously there is a sort of massive smear job going on, and it's also the case that, you know, even if perhaps Nero hadn't been kind of succeeded by a completely different lot of emperors, he might have had a fairly poor reputation amongst the Roman elite, because there are clearly a lot of things he does which are quite unpopular with those who see themselves as being very attached to the Senate, like Tacitus in particular, and also Cassius Dio, who's another Roman senator writing his history in the 3rd century. So the senators, clearly there's a strong tradition of senatorial hostility to Nero. There's also some evidence that Nero was very popular with the Roman people, or some Roman people, and even Tacitus concedes that when Nero died, there were some people skipped around the streets wearing caps of liberty, celebrating their new freedom, but the very lowest of the low, the worst people in Rome, were devastated when Nero died, according to Tacitus. And we can easily see that as a sort of warped representation of the fact that Nero did have a connection with the Roman people, that all the games he put on, which are catalogued in great detail, particularly by Suetonius. He's very, very interested in games of all kinds, those were very popular. I mean, at the same time, I think we need to bear in mind that what, in some ways, saying that someone is popular with the Roman people is itself a form of criticism if it comes from Tacitus. So it's not necessarily a positive to say that Nero is popular with the people. If we think about the material evidence, and there's some really interesting things in the exhibition. There's graffiti from Pompeii where Nero does seem to have had quite a positive reception, and we could connect that with the fact that Poppaea, whom Tom mentioned earlier, her family came from around Pompeii. There's a sort of wonderful graffiti that celebrates Nero and Poppaea coming to the Temple of Venus in Pompeii and bringing lavish gifts, and that seems that's described in very positive terms. So a sort of connection with a sort of celebration of Nero. But I think if we want to think about this in a different way, and I'd like to come back to some of the points that Will raised, we could think about how what we could see Nero doing is actually exploring quite a different way of being an emperor from, say, the way that Augustus did. So Nero is exploring a way of being a Roman emperor that isn't like being first among equals, living a conspicuously modest life, doing lots of public works, although actually Nero does do quite a lot of public works in terms of rebuilding the city after the fire and so on, and building a marketplace, doing works, improving the harbour at Ostia to improve the corn supply, all those sorts of things that, other emperors too do to that kind of clearly it could be seen as improving the quality of life for people. But there's a sense in which the way Nero presents himself is a kind of deliberate rejection of the kind of traditional Roman senatorial model of the sort of political man who is someone who achieves great military victories. Nero is conspicuously not interested in expanding the empire. He's not interested in talking to the army. It might strain his voice and prevent him from singing. But there's also this sort of Nero who wants to be flamboyant and build himself a magnificent house. And when he builds his golden house, according to Suetonius, he says, "At last I can live like a human being." And I think that's kind of an interesting moment where we can see the idea of the emperor as the figure who can indulge his appetites in a way that anybody might want to do, but he's got the resources to do it. So there's a sort of sense there of a kind of, and this perhaps goes back to someone who shares the tastes of the ordinary people who might themselves want to do that sort of thing and not follow the stuffy old Senate and their kind of boring culture of discipline and old-fashioned morality, but actually have some fun, have parties, have lavish dinners, really indulge yourself. And that's a kind of model. And it's of course impossible to know how far Nero was pursuing that in a sort of self-conscious way. But we could nevertheless, I think it's quite interesting to think about that as a sort of model of imperial power, which is really radically different from the sort of Augustus model, which, you know, at the beginning of his reign, he claimed he wanted to follow, but that was no doubt Seneca breathing down his neck.
So the shades of Berlusconi, though, are these, or perhaps the other way round.
Yes.
Berlusconi has shades of Nero with his lavish parties. But so one thing that interests me, what I'd like to find out is, what are the people to Nero? So if Nero was currying favour with the people, why was that in this particular Roman system? Why was that necessary or useful for him? I mean, it's not like he was living in a democracy that he had to manipulate in the way perhaps that we might see in populist democratic regimes of the present. Well, I mean, you could answer that, or Tom. Catherine, go, because you were on the roll.
Okay, I suppose, I mean, I think this is where the games are enormously important, because, you know, the culture of games in Rome is very kind of much at the heart of political life under the Principate, that you have these kind of extended sequences of games, whether they're kind of, you know, fights in the amphitheatre, whether they're races in the circus, or, you know, plays in the theatre, where the Roman people go to be part of a big group, and a big group that kind of sees its emperor, and where the emperor interacts directly with the audience. And that's, I think, very important. And there's a sort of nice moment in Suetonius where he says Nero hated anybody else he thought was popular with the people. There's a sort of sense that, you know, he wants that to be an exclusive relationship. The people should love him. He's the provider of these wonderful games, and he wants the love from the audience that he gets when he goes to the games, and that's a sort of very validating thing for him.
But it's not. Is it constitutionally important for them to be on side at this point in Roman history, or do the plebs, the people, have political power? Because it also seems to me it feels like a very Roman, specifically, I'm talking about the city of Rome phenomenon. The empire is enormous, so. Why is he bothering with this kind of small group of people in Rome? Why is that important? Well,
I mean, in a way, the constitution is sort of irrelevant in some ways. I mean, in theory, you know, the Senate and people of Rome are sovereign, but the emperor has, you know, the power over the Roman army, and that's kind of really the basis of his power, essentially. So you could say that, you know, remaining popular with the troops is what's really crucial, but he doesn't have much interaction with them, or it's all kind of, you know, yes, there's the Praetorian Guard in Rome, and but, you know, most of the legions are far away, and so his relationship with them is kind of a highly mediated one. But the people of Rome are kind of, you know, very, very much kind of there, and I think it is that sort of sense of I mean, and this is where Nero is a showman, Nero is a sort of celebrity, that sort of sense of kind of needing the kind of, you know, needing all those likes. I mean, he kind of really needs that affirmation that the people love him. He's got his paid claque who kind of sit in the audience and kind of do, you know, initiate the applause when he performs. But that's a kind of it's not in a sense something that he's not going out there wanting people to vote for him in an election. It's kind of a more immediate sense of kind of support.
I wonder, Will, if this is ringing any contemporary bells, because it's enormously tempting to be incredibly unsophisticated about this and say, you know, well, you know, Trump is the Nero of the 21st.
Well, I mean, there are some pretty obvious connections, which I'm sure many in the audience have already spotted a few of them. I mean, Trump obviously was obsessed with his crowds. We know that, and he was, you know, fixated. He spent his first month in office still talking about how big his inauguration crowd was. He went on rallies when he had no need to, because because he loved the crowds. Every time he got sort of depressed by the fact that he had to try and govern the country and run the White House, they would take him off to a rally in Florida or something to try and sort of cheer him up, because that's what he felt was good. It made him feel good, and he said these. He used the language of love. He had famously said on the 2016 trail, he said, attacking the Democrats for being a bunch of sort of pointy-headed liberals on the East Coast. He said, I love the poorly educated. He said, I love you people. You're poorly educated. I love the poorly educated. And that was seen as a very sort of positive, rather sort of curious kind of compliment. So, I mean, that sort of sense of needing that great kind of intimacy. I mean, this is not, various sort of social theorists and psychoanalysts and sociologists have written about this a lot in the 20th century, particularly in relation to fascism. Many figures in the Frankfurt School were particularly alarmed by this capacity to create a sort of psychic intimacy between leader and crowd from a platform. So this has long been seen as a kind of particularly in the modern era as something very dangerous, and Napoleon would be the other kind of key kind of modern reference point in all of this. The other thing which I think is worth highlighting, just when we're talking about Trump, is the lurking danger in all of this, because the ultimate, Trump began in office obsessed with the size of the inauguration crowd. He left office with a crowd storming the Capitol building, literally seeking to murder Mike Pence and possibly other people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and so on. So there were, the crowd turned into a force of genuine violent threat and murderous threat, and he encouraged that, and he still has this extraordinary stranglehold over the Republican Party via that sort of strange sort of emotional and cultural relationship that he still managed to sustain, where certain people considered him to be kind of on some level pure. Well, maybe not pure, because he's kind of his moral flaws are all on the outside, but on some sense there's a kind of an honesty about his sort of sheer kind of awfulness, I suppose, in a way that is considered not to be true of the kind of insider professional politicians and so on.
I mean, Tom, it's a kind of, in a way, it always seems quite a sort of curious relationship, that why would the people, as it were, be attracted to, someone who displays enormous wealth and splendor and richness beyond their every dream, while at the same time deprecating this other so-called elite. All these.
Well, I think the answer lies in the fact that before Rome becomes an autocracy, it was a republic, and it's that status that Rome had as a republic, of course, that joins it perhaps to the United States, which likewise establishes itself as a republic very much on the model of Rome. And in the Roman Republic, Will said that populism is really a style of rhetoric, and politics in the Roman Republic was not really about kind of issues. It wasn't arguments over, tax or whatever. It was really about style. It was about the way that you promoted yourself. And very reductively, you could say that there were kind of two approaches to this. There was one that was embodied by people who called themselves the optimates, the best, or the boni, the good guys, which gives you a sense of the tradition that they're coming from. And these are people who identify with the traditional virtues, the traditional values, rugged, upstanding, sometimes kind of rebarbatively moral in their kind of public stance, the way that they promote themselves and project themselves. And then you have figures who are called populares, and populists may not, it's not a bad translation of them. And these are guys who are just as rich, just as aristocratic, just as well bred as the boni, but who make it very public that they share the interests and the passions of the people. So rather like Berlusconi buying a football team, Julius Caesar, who is the kind of archetype of the popularis, lavishes money on buying silver armor for gladiators. And it's important that the popularis shows that he cares about the people, because he identifies with them and he enjoys their pleasures. And what Augustus does, his genius is really to fuse those two traditions. So he promotes himself as, he's a senator, he's a magistrate. He claims to have restored the kind of the ancestral traditions of the Roman people and the republican system of government, while at the same time, Julius Caesar, when he was at the amphitheatre, actually, despite the fact that he laid on gladiators, he would make a point of doing his correspondence, so people could see that he wasn't particularly interested. Augustus, he's absolutely sharing the passion. It's kind of like Tony Blair practicing headers with Kevin Keegan. He's letting people know that he's interested in this. And essentially what happens over the course of the succession, the various members of the Julian and Claudian families that succeed Augustus, is that they go either one way. So Tiberius, he's very much a kind of optimate. He's very much, he despises the people. He's notorious for never putting on any games, and therefore he's disliked. Caligula goes absolutely to the opposite extreme. I mean, he lives fast. The Senate absolutely hate him, but the people think he's rather cool. Claudius again veers back to the kind of optimate tradition, and Nero kind of absolutely goes full-blown popularis. Now, why does this matter to America? I think it's more than just tangential. I think it's, or indeed tendentious, because America likewise has this foundational myth in which the founding fathers are rugged, they're farmers, they're soldiers, they're born to the plow, all this kind of stuff. And even though obviously over the 2 centuries that have followed the American Revolution, America's become a completely different society, that kind of primal myth of American statesmen who are soldiers, who are principled, who will sacrifice themselves for other people, still has tremendous currency. And the guy, I think, who absolutely exemplified that was John McCain, who Trump notoriously mocked as a loser because he'd been caught when when his plane crashed. And he'd been tortured, and he'd rather than kind of accept an offer from the Viet Cong to go back early because he was the son of an important figure in America, he refused that. That's like something out of the early pages of Livy, and so McCain was respected for that. And so when McCain died, there was the remarkable spectacle of Democrats and Republicans, all the presidents, gathering for the funeral. And Trump very, very ostentatiously was not invited. And you have McCain's daughter standing up and essentially saying that the Republican and Democrat presidents who were there were the embodiment of the Republic, and that Trump was somehow a kind of intruder. He was a kind of a vulgar charlatan. And Catherine would say better than me because she's written the definitive book on the way that Romans exploited funerals. But that seemed to me a very, very Roman moment, using the funeral of this very public figure to kind of lambast Trump. And I think the reason why there are echoes, as I said, of Rome, it's because the founding fathers modeled themselves on this kind of ideal of the early republic, and it's still kind of a shadow. So I do think it works better with America than perhaps it does, say, with Britain or other countries like that.
Yeah, that's so interesting and completely brilliant. Thank you, Tom. But nevertheless, is there a kind of populist leaders toolkit? Big popular public works tick. Kind of.
Well, obviously, yeah. I don't know if there's a toolkit. I think I think clearly the media is now the sort of central tool, it's interesting actually, this issue of the things like the graffiti that was mentioned earlier in relation to Nero. There's a theory that Trump kind of his presidential because everyone thought, of course, this is impossible. This is never going to happen. He's never going to become president. And yet actually kind of online meme culture played a very important role early on in terms of people sort of creating these kind of Trump memes that began to circulate initially around kind of outright message boards. And there was a sort of, some social scientists study what they call fandom, which is a little bit like being a kind of football fan in a way, where people just sort of, just want to associate themselves with a kind of a brand in a way. So there's a kind of a branding issue. I think, you could say, I don't know if Johnson fits the populist type very well, but nevertheless, the sort of, the blonde mop of hair and the name Boris and the sort of, there's a kind of a recognizable brand that you can get behind without knowing the first thing about any of his policies. And I think that's being able to kind of mobilize something like that is a very important part of the toolkit, such that you can become something that can invite followers, because ultimately that's I mean, when I think it's interesting actually, the term follower it means all these things on social media today, but I think when you think of what a follower implies, it implies motion. Which is that I'm going to get you somewhere. If you follow me, don't worry if I'm telling the truth or lying, or whether I'm doing good things or bad things. If you follow me, we're going to get to some destination that we all share, and that's the sort of, I think, when I think about the distinction between the conventional politicians, they don't necessarily kind of promise to kind of take people anywhere. They promise perhaps to serve the people or promote the public interest, or these slightly more kind of static concepts of trying to sort of reflect back to people what they want in some way. Whereas the notion of the kind of disruptor and of the leader who has followers is they're going to kind of break through this sort of thing and end up somewhere else altogether.
Catherine, can you connect that trope or mode to Nero, or do you think that's just not really what's going on? I mean, is Nero promising to take? I mean, is he promising something, or is his main aim just to kind of stay alive and keep in power and have fun?
I think the having fun is actually very important. But I suppose. I mean, to go back to one of the things that Tom was talking about, I mean, the popularist politicians, one of the things we have to remember is that that's always an insult to call someone a popularist. No one ever says, I'm a popularist. It's always kind of what you call your political opponents because they're kind of, courting the support of the mob. But of course, from our perspective, we can say, well, someone like Clodius in the 50s BCE is perhaps the most notorious of the popularists. He was someone who actually realized that the common people of Rome were completely desperate and really needed a better food supply, and he kind of gave them that, and that brought him an enormous popular following. So he's taken them to kind of food security, fairly which we would see as a kind of fairly basic need rather than a kind of frivolous populist indulgence. That with Nero, it's not at all clear that he's particularly concerned with the kind of the comfort and safety of the people of Rome.
Not even with his building projects, Catherine, because that's a sort of defence, isn't it, of Nero? Yeah. In a sense, I think there is a kind of stream in the brilliant exhibition that is a kind of defence of Nero. It's not the full revisionism, but there's a kind of there's an invitation to look at as an alternative view, and one of the alternative views that we're invited to consider is that A, Nero was in no way responsible for the burning of Rome, but B, he took some care to rebuild, after this awful Grenfell times 50 catastrophe, took care to institute better building regulations and build back better, I suppose. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah, no. I mean, you can tell that story in relation to the tiny fragments of information that we have about what Nero built and taken from coins as much as from the sort of handful of references in Suetonius and Tacitus. So yes, I mean you could make that claim, but the sources are very much not interested in making that claim, and the kind of populism that they attribute to Nero is much more not so much wanting to please the people, as although he kind of laps up that sense of being appreciated, but somehow pursuing his appetites in a way that is kind of characteristic of sort of lower mortals. So it's that kind of the pursuit of license, if you like. It's that licentiousness which is seen as a kind of what the plebeian Romans would do if they could, kind of thing, rather than sticking with the the kind of boring self-discipline that someone like Seneca is constantly trying to inculcate in his pupil. So I suppose this is kind of to go back to the idea of Nero as a kind of capturing people's imaginations by kind of indulging himself in an incredibly sort of inventive way, if you like. And Tom touched earlier on some of the extremely inventive ways of kinds of self-indulgence that were attributed to Nero. So it's that sort of that sense of a kind of a sort of freedom, if you like, that is meant to have an appeal to those whose lives are unbelievably constricted.
But there's another resonance that you made me consider another resonance, really. That I think the idea of framing yourself as doing what any ordinary person would want to, but just in a kind of staggeringly kind of rich and over the top way. Isn't that a bit like kind of Trump kind of living in a sort of ludicrous gold tax palace, but also eating burgers and kind of really self-consciously doing that?
I think there's definitely, I mean, something which has been spotted in kind of voting behaviour all over, well, in the United States, but also in the UK. I mean, there's a sort of a real problem that particularly kind of centre liberal left parties have, which is that a lot of voters from more traditional working class backgrounds feel that they are looked down upon by those with certain qualifications, living in certain locales, university towns, metropolitan cities, and so on, and that actually people might often feel more insulted by someone feeling that they are kind of culturally superior to them on grounds of education and so on, than they do by someone who is manifestly financially superior to them. That actually, you know, someone who's financially superior can still be in touch with people because they're not claiming to be culturally superior. I'm not saying that that's necessarily an accurate representation of how kind of, you know, the liberal elites actually behave. It might be in certain instances, but I think that there's clearly been a sense that someone like Trump embodies in various ways, that actually, yeah, if I had that much money, I would do that. I would do the same thing. I mean, there's a very famous ethnography of Tea Party supporters, actually just pre-Trump, by an American sociologist called Arlie Russell Hochschild, where she spends 5 years living with these Tea Party supporters in Louisiana, and she's sort of wondering why they're not more angry with BP, the oil company, for the fact that the oil spills in the Gulf had done various damage to the fishing industry and so on. And their response was, well, actually, you know, they're a company, they're trying to make profits. That we're trying to make profits as well. We can sort of identify, even with this very large corporation, they can sort of identify with a logic of sort of profit maximization more than with a logic of kind of, you know, sort of welfare implementation and what they perceive as being the kind of the interests of the sort of northeastern elite, the liberal elite, who, oh, they want to come down here and fix all our problems. They don't know anything about our problems. Why do they think they're on my side? They know nothing about me, and so on. Whereas there's a kind of a sort of basic sort of economic commonality between even the super rich and the person who's simply trying to get by, which I think has played out in democracy in various ways over the last 10 years. I think in quite manifest ways. You know, and Berlusconi has been mentioned already, another example. Where effectively a sort of, you know, a celebrity culture mixed with a certain kind of bling culture, I suppose, can have this sort of a so-called kind of populist dimension, because monetary gain is something that arguably everybody can relate to in a way that, you know, pursuing some kind of whatever it might be, you know, the sort of language of sort of economics or social reform can seem rather kind of esoteric and distant in some way.
I mean, Charlotte. Yeah, I mean, Trump is a showman. I mean, that's kind of key to his appeal, I think. I think it one of the things that always struck me as kind of very revealing about him was his fascination with wrestling, which is kind of absolutely on the cusp between being an authentic sport and yet completely staged. And there's a kind of amazing sequence where he wrestles with the president of the World Wrestling Federation and wins, and then kind of shaves him on TV. And in a sense, the role that he plays in The Apprentice, and then the role that he plays as President of the United States is a kind of similar. He's kind of play acting. He's kind of playing the role that maybe people would dream of doing, of presenting a television series, of being the President of the United States. It's all showmanship, and in a sense, I think the same is true of Nero. Except what I would say for on behalf of Nero, slightly sticking up for him, is that I think that he must have had an order of talent to hold a stage or to race a chariot at the Olympics, because the stereotype, the myth that I articulated is that this is all kind of comic. He's hopeless, he's terrible. But actually, I mean, it's the equivalent of headlining at Glastonbury or racing in Formula One or something. I mean, it takes risk. And the thing about being an emperor, going to say to a gladiatorial show, is that you are kind of risking being booed. I mean, I can't think of a similar autocratic system really anywhere in the world where a figure like a Caesar subjects himself to a kind of public display of approval or disapproval. So you have to be fairly confident that the crowd isn't just going to laugh at you and kind of pelt you off the stage. So I suspect that Nero was probably better at gigging than he might have the subsequent reputation for. And to race in the Olympics, I mean, he has far more horses than the average contender in the Olympics racing a chariot has. It's incredibly dangerous. And so in a sense, to be thrown and then get back into a chariot is like crashing a Formula One car and then getting back into it. So again, kind of respect to him. And when Nero dies, you have this year of the four emperors that Catherine mentioned. So two of them, Galba and Vespasian, who ultimately emerges as the emperor, they are playing the kind of the rugged soldier, the stern disciplinarian. But there are two others, Otho and Vitellius, both of whom consciously kind of echo the Neronian role. And I think that if either one of them had survived as emperor, we might well have a very different perspective on Nero, because I think that there is something there in the atmosphere, in the political atmosphere, that is still politically potent, even a year after Nero's suicide.
Well, this is very interesting. I just want to, at this point, put out a quick reminder to those who are with us online watching. Do keep sending in your questions, because we will certainly be turning to them pretty soon, and I'm looking forward to kind of getting the panel to get to grips with them. But Catherine, I want to bring you in because you were looking wonderfully sceptical whilst Tom was speaking, and I think you may have something to say.
Thank you, Charlotte. Yes, I mean, in a way, you're right, Tom. But I mean, clearly, Nero devoted a huge amount of energy to his interest in chariot racing and his singing. And Suetonius talks about how incredibly carefully he practiced. He did all these exercises to improve his voice, although his voice still wasn't very good. But I think we need to bear in mind that there perhaps is an element of risk when you perform in front of an audience, but maybe the risk is somewhat diminished when your soldiers are physically present in the performance space. And there are stories about how people weren't allowed to leave, no matter what their excuse. Women, about to give birth, but not allowed to leave because Nero's performing. So, at least according to the accounts we have, the audience response is very much kind of controlled. And again, sort of inducing members of the elite to participate in his shows. I mean, we could read that as, they were all really happy to do it. But as Tacitus says, the money of someone who can force you to do something is in itself persuasive. So, he's got the sort of backup, the military backup to get everyone, perhaps disposed to be appreciative of his efforts.
I'm actually going to bring in a question that's just cropped up and from the audience here, from Anthony Murphy, who's challenging us. He's saying, aren't the panelists projecting too much from ancient Rome onto today's political situation? They are totally different, and he quite rightly points out. He thinks maybe the Nero-Trump analogy is spurious. Have we been too glib here, or do you think we're secure in noticing echoes and resonances.
Well, I think it's kind of mildly valid because, as I said, the American Republic consciously modelled itself on the Roman Republic. Of course, I mean the differences are just astronomically profound, but it has meant that the sense of nostalgia for a kind of rugged republican virtue that ran through the Roman Republic, I think to that extent is a kind of living tradition within the American Republic as well, which is why, I mean, I don't think there's any parallel whatsoever between Nero and Boris Johnson or, you know, Jeremy Corbyn, still less. But I think in the case of the United States, there is perhaps just a kind of glimmering of a justification for comparing these two obviously incredibly different systems.
Okay, so one thing I just do want to ask Will actually is, just to turn to something slightly different, is like, with populism, what are the stakes? I mean, is it easy to come back from populism and to reinstate?
Well, I mean, first of all, go back to what
is it something that can blow up in your face? I mean, and you know, you could bite off more than you can chew, and civil unrest and all the rest of it. I mean, what? Yeah.
I mean, so first of all, as I was saying at the beginning, within the kind of textbook understanding of populism, it's a style of rhetoric and it's a style of leadership, and lots of people have been accused of populism. Thatcher was accused of populism at certain points to do with, you know, the right to buy was seen as a populist measure by some people. Actually, going back to the point about the you know, the pejorative sense of the I can't remember the Latin word popularis, but you know that this is a kind of only used as a pejorative term. Populism tends to be used as a pejorative term, and that's why, you know, a lot of people, particularly on the left, resent being called populist because they feel like it's as you know, like Syriza and Podemos and others have less actually. Podemos actually have been fine with it, but others have thought that this is just a way of sort of dismissing democracy. You know, well, it's not populism, it's democracy, and so it's worth remembering that. I think the other thing is, you know, there are elements of populism all over the place. I mean, that style of rhetoric of drawing that moralistic distinction between the kind of pure ordinary people and the sort of corrupt self-interested elite, politicians are always doing this. There are elements of it all over the place. Blair was also accused sometimes of being a populist. So it's a kind of you could say it's a kind of a sort of seed that you sort of scatter around the place. I think that the question is if it turns into something where you're taking direct aim at the basic institutions of civil society, and obviously I'm talking in the liberal sense now. I mean, the term populism originates in the late 19th century in Kansas. It's had a sort of resurgence over the last sort of 20 years. So I'm talking about something quite modern and recent. But where I suppose people become afraid is either where it starts to become entangled with manifestly racist or other type of prejudicial ways of distinguishing that ordinary people. You know, oh, those people are not part of the ordinary people. They're from somewhere else. They're outside us for some reason. That's a danger. There are dangers of sort of resuscitating kind of pre-liberal or illiberal policies surrounding whatever it might be, the family or whatever it might be. I think that where it takes direct aim at the institutions of liberal democracy and the foundations of civil society in some ways, whether it be, you know, I don't know, the Parliament or public service broadcasters, whatever it might be. The question is, how real is that threat? Is it purely rhetorical and sort of, you know, kind of saber rattling, or does it really threaten something much more severe? And there was a major debate in the United States amongst political scientists and political commentators as to whether the term fascist could be used to describe Trump. And there were some people who thought it could because he spoke like a fascist. That much was clear. He certainly spoke like a fascist. The question, and this is where historians such as Richard Evans came in and said, well, actually, you know, until he's actually taken control of the police and there is street violence and actual kind of, you know, this sort of suspension of rule of law, that term should not be used. And so obviously those are the ultimate stakes, is whether rule of law will be suspended and whether you actually start to close down the institutions of parliamentary liberal democracy. Those are the ultimate stakes. We know that from the 20th century. The question is whether speaking in this sort of quasi-fascistic way of, you know, some people said that Farage's celebration speech on the night of the Brexit referendum was fascistic, where where he said this is a victory for ordinary people. Well, who did he mean by that? He probably didn't mean, various people who had been on the losing side of that. And what did that mean? But that was still in the domain of rhetoric and not in the domain of political or constitutional reform.
So I wanted to then, Catherine, ask you about how dangerous it is. I mean, how fragile it is balancing, but if you're a Roman emperor or a Roman politician, being part of this very strange and it seems fragile balance between the people, the Senate, the figure of the emperor, when all these forms are in flux. And the whole, as has been pointed out, that sort of the whole kind of clever thing that Augustus did was to retain the forms of traditional government, accreting to himself numerous titles, so that he became sort of everything and all at once, but claiming to be restoring traditional values, but at the same time playing this kind of interesting game with autocracy. Perhaps you could respond to that not very elegant question, Catherine.
Well, I mean, I think it is, you're absolutely right that it is a very sort of fragile balance, and it is one where a lot of things are not fully articulated. And indeed, the position of the emperor is something that's not really spelled out until the time when Vespasian comes to power, and they actually then, at that point, have a law on exactly what Vespasian's rights and duties are. That's the first time it's properly spelled out. And before that, it's just this sort of, the natural personal authority of Augustus, who been successful in all those civil wars and kind of killed all his enemies or forgiven others, that kind of holds the thing together. And then his successors, who in various ways imperfectly kind of occupy that place. I mean, in a way, we don't have a sort of sense of robust institutions in the way that we do in modern liberal democracies. I mean, Tiberius sort of does away with the elections for consuls. They just get chosen by other members of the Senate. So the Senate is seen as a repository of traditional Roman authority and a sort of bastion of kind of legitimacy. Senators are the people who go out and govern Roman provinces. They're the people who command Roman armies. So any emperor really needs those people on side. But then there's also exactly what the kind of balance of responsibilities and authority is between the emperor and the Senate is this very sort of tricky an undefined kind of area. The emperor is meant to consult the Senate. The Senate is deferential to the emperor. Tacitus talks about how the Senate start behaving like slaves in relation to the emperor Tiberius because they just agree to whatever they think he wants. So it's a very difficult dynamic of anticipating what you think the emperor wants, or the sort of self-enslaving of the Senate. And what we see with Nero is a kind of, I can't really be bothered with the Senate. There's a sort of wonderful moment in Suetonius where Nero's inaugurating the works on the Isthmus of Corinth, sort of great sort of slightly megalomaniac public work scheme to sort of cut through the isthmus. And he does it, he sort of makes vows in the name of the Roman people and himself, and he leaves out the Senate, and that's seen as a very sort of conspicuous kind of sidelining of the Senate in a way that and then obviously that's then he's supposedly kind of has executed loads of senators on the grounds that they're involved in conspiracies to kill him, and that becomes the sort of the dominant theme of the latter years of his reign. And then unsurprisingly, that they're not terribly keen to support him by that point. But he also, and the other kind of crucial thing about the Roman emperor is his relationship to the army. I mean, that's kind of somewhat occluded by Augustus towards in the latter years of his reign, but is absolutely fundamental for underpinning the emperor. And Nero is just not interested in the army at all. So he doesn't want to speak to them, as I mentioned earlier. He's not interested in, when Vindex revolts, Nero kind of doesn't want to hear about it because he's busy with his music. So it's this sort of, really the whole business of government is extremely tedious for Nero. He doesn't really want to think about it. So it's a sort of mixture of not taking seriously the traditional concerns of Roman politics, but also at certain points apparently kind of really distorting the kind of balance, the very precarious balance that had traditionally existed between those different bodies, which are all sort of tensely interconnected.
Yeah. Never ignore the army if you're an autocrat. I'd say that seems to be quite a crucial part of retaining power. There have been a couple of questions about Agrippina, and that's good because I wanted to ask about Agrippina. So Agrippina was Nero's mother, who was very elaborately killed, as Tom described. One of my favourite sort of parts of the mythical, well, or not mythical story is Nero's construction or his commission to construct a special self-collapsing boat that would drown Agrippina. But Max Cody-like, she kind of flails her way to the shore. So I'm interested in and this is a special area of yours, Catherine, having written about the figures of the women around Julio Claudian court, who, you know, in Tacitus and, well, particularly in Suetonius, are kind of wonderfully powerful, scheming, incredible women. And is that really true? Is that really what they were like? Or is this all a kind of, you know, again, a kind of elite myth making in which we can tell how dreadful all these people were because their wives were kind of interfering in politics?
Well, I mean, it's very interesting because I think the exhibition goes for the sort of latter narrative, that there's no reason to suppose that Agrippina had any influence at all, and the only reason that Nero had her killed was because he was under pressure, because her perceived influence made him unpopular, and so therefore he had his mother murdered. This seems, I think that's perhaps a little bit of a parody of the position in the exhibition, but I think that seems to me somewhat implausible. I think it's absolutely right to say that the influence of women in the imperial family is resented by the senatorial elite. Part of the reason it's resented is because it makes absolutely palpable the fact that power is inherited, that it matters who your mother is. That's become tremendously significant. Nero is a significant part of Nero's claim to have the right to be emperor is that he's descended from Augustus, but he's descended from Augustus through his mother Agrippina, who is Augustus' great-granddaughter. So she's crucially important. But at the same time, we could also imagine that, as a 16-year-old, when he comes to power, it's not surprising if he relies on his mother, who has the experience of having been not only the wife of the previous emperor, but also the sister of the one before that, and who is emerged as an extraordinary survivor. So there's a good reason to suppose that Nero would have deferred to a degree to his mother, and would have been quite wise to do so, really. And she is certainly presented as Tacitus in particular, I think, sees her authority as entirely sort of improper, and kind of presents us with these scenes of her sort of muscling in, trying to kind of lay claim to the sort of authority of her ancestors. But he presents that as being completely wrong, because she's a woman and really only senators should be exercising power.
What about you, Tom? Are you a believer in the collapsible boat story?
It's too good not to believe in it. When in doubt, believe the myth.
Will, it seems like it is a pretty long-standing trope, though. I mean, this is slightly aside from populism as such, to be fair, but that if things are a bit doubtful about, or if one doesn't really like one's current political leader, attention might fall rather slightingly on the wife, particularly if they seem to have a mind of their own, and that's as much true of Cherie Blair as as kind of Carrie.
Yeah,
John,
no, that's right. I mean, it's not a it's probably not something that is specific to this populist moment or this populist mode. But I think that I guess this is a something that runs throughout political history, and this idea of there being someone who's behind the scenes, who's actually in power, and so on. And I mean, we see it in Britain at the moment in relation to Carrie Johnson. I mean, this is so it's that in that sense there is clearly this is a fairly common trope, I think.
I want to ask a question that's been offered from the audience, and it's about Putin. It's from an anonymous attendee, so thank you, anonymous. But maybe you could think about this, Tom, as Tsar or Caesar. How is Putin? I'm not going to try and do a Russian accent. How is Vladimir Putin learning from classical populism? Do you think he is, Tom?
No, probably not. But there is, of course, Moscow is the third Rome in line of descent from the second Rome, Constantinople, which in turn is in line of descent from the original Rome. So there is a kind of perhaps a slight element there. I mean, I think the time when the classical inheritance, I think, did impact on Putin was the annexation of Crimea, which was settled by the Greeks. And prior to the invasion of Crimea, there was a tremendous posed shot of Putin going out scuba diving in the Black Sea and miraculously discovering a Greek amphora, which had hitherto been, who knew? There it was. But the real reason why the Crimea mattered to Putin was that it was the location where Vladimir became Christian. And got accepted into the Orthodox Church. And so there is this, the ruler who prior to Putin had annexed the Crimea was Catherine the Great. And there's a letter that Potemkin writes to Catherine saying, you are now the mistress of the Crimea, which, is our link to the world of Alexander and Pompey the Great, but also the birthplace of Russian Christianity. And so I think it's telling that, the propaganda that surrounded that, you had Putin with the Greek amphora, but you also had Russian priests kind of blessing fighter planes before they set off. And so that sense of Putin was situating that campaign definitely, in the context of the deep past of Russia. But I think in general, no. I mean, Russia stands at a remove from the Latin world, and it's important that Russia culturally is not, say, a part of Latin Christendom.
Sort of connected with that question, Alex Vios. Forgive me if I've mispronounced that name, Alex, asks, to what extent being cast in the role of the beast caused Nero to accrete so many subsequent bad reputations? So, yeah, that's a good question about how far this kind of whole thing about, being mean to Christians and has been absolutely kind of enormous in his subsequent reception. What would you say to that, Catherine?
Well, I mean, I do think it's always very striking that, yes, I often received inquiries from people who say, well, we're making a series about the 10 most evil men in history, and obviously we're going to do a program about Nero. And it's somehow that you sort of think, well, actually, I think if you're going to think about mass murderers, yes, Nero is alleged to have bumped off quite a lot of Roman senators, but really in the great scheme of things, is he quite as bad as some of the other candidates one might find? I mean, and I think really the stories about Nero and the Christians are completely crucial for that, and the whole sort of the kind of early Christian churches kind of reconfiguring of Nero, and Tom will know much more about this than I do, but I think it is a really important part of his reputation. In the 19th century, again, we kind of come back to that the sort of Nero's role in the persecution of the Christians as a sign completely crucial aspect of his reputation as one of history's most evil men. I mean, obviously, the stories about the fire, fiddling while Rome burned, it is kind of a key element in the tradition, and bumping off his relatives. Some people think that's worse than other people, but that's that. But the Christians, I think, it is very important to see that as kind of inflecting reception.
Looming very large. I mean, Tom, as Catherine says, but maybe you'd like to respond to that. I mean, obviously you've written about the first 1,000 years of Christianity in your 2,000 years of Christianity in your book Dominion. So how influential, how big a stumbling block is that between us and understanding Nero in a sense?
I think it's been absolutely crucial because, Tacitus is forgotten for a long stretch of the Middle Ages, and Suetonius kind of survives by a thread. But Nero's reputation as the man who puts Peter and Paul to death is fundamental to his, because when the Roman Empire in the West falls, the status of Rome as the capital of Christendom is dependent not really on the fact that it had been, the imperial capital, although that does have a kind, it has a kind of resonance still, but really it's dependent on the fact that the relics of St. Peter in particular are there, but also of St. Paul. And so therefore the status of Nero as the man who ordered them put to death is kind of central to the status of Rome as the capital of medieval Christendom. And therefore it feeds into art and all kinds of stories. And I think that you see the kind of enduring effect of that right the way up into a kind of film like Quo Vadis, where, it's a crucial part of the kind of monstrosity of the part played by Peter Ustinov that you have this kind of Christian context set it against. And in a sense, even with the fading of doctrinal Christianity, I think that the Hollywood epics still have this need to contextualize the evil of Roman emperors. So if you look at Gladiator, it's not a Christian, but you do have Derek Jacobi playing somebody who rather improbably wants to restore the Republic, which is cast as being the equivalent of a kind of, a liberal democracy or something. So it seems pretty much you can't have an epic featuring an evil Roman emperor without a Christian or a liberal providing some contextualization for him.
It's another reminder of our inability to untangle ourselves from the present moment when looking back at this deep past. And Susan Biddle, in the audience member, says, our analogies are always driven by our own circumstances. In the 1930s, were comparisons drawn between fascist leaders and Nero, for instance, in relation to public works, e.g. autobahns, Italian trains and improvements to porters, rebuilding Berlin and Rome, Nazi rallies compared with Neronian games and entertainment, and so on. Who can speak to the reception of Roman emperors and Nero in the 1930s? Catherine.
Well, it's very striking that particularly Mussolini, but also Hitler, are very preoccupied with the model of the ancient Romans. Mussolini has the good fortune of the bimillennium of the birth of Augustus and falling in 1937, and there's a huge amount of money goes into archaeology and into projecting Mussolini as the new Augustus. This is the return of Roman greatness and so on. I'm afraid I don't know whether any of Mussolini's critics chose to cast him rather as Nero. It might have been a tempting critique to adopt. But it's absolutely the case that Roman parallels were to the forefront, and there's some amazing pictures of Hitler visiting Rome, to see this great new exhibition of Romanness, which was put on to celebrate the bimillennium, and Hitler and Mussolini are going around this together, kind of savouring the wholesome Roman past. It's a Roman past that's about kind of building up young men to be a fighting force rather than kind of decadent parties. So they're not very interested in that. That sort of Neronian tradition is not one that they invoke themselves.
I mean, I think it's absolutely true that our understanding of ancient Rome is mediated through many different reinterpretations of it, and I would say that the fascist reinterpretation of it is an absolutely primal one. I mean, the very name fascism obviously is deriving from Rome, and in a sense, the readiness to call Trump a fascist is kind of tribute to that. I think the way in which, because the Nazis themselves were modeling themselves on Rome, so there is a kind of distorted echo of Rome in that comparison. I think it says something about Nero's historical reputation that people did, that no fascist, no Nazi ever compared Mussolini or Hitler to Nero, because that wasn't the kind of reputation that you want. And Nero, Hitler was a rather ascetic man who disapproved of the kind of stuff that Nero got up to. And I think that in a way it kind of serves as a reminder that one of the things about Nero, and it sounds a kind of a terrible thing to say about a guy who killed his mother and castrated boys and did all kinds of terrible things, but he does have this slight sense that he was fun.
Oh, God.
Because if the comparison is with Caligula, I think is seen as a terrifying figure. He's the terrifying figure of the tyrant. I mean, Nero also is terrifying, but you have the slight sense that his antics can be played for comic effect, which is why Peter Ustinov's role is so entertaining. And one of the the ways in which he's been reinterpreted over recent decades in the academic field is that sense of fun is something that Nero is very self-consciously playing with. So in the Peter Ustinov performance, he's a risible figure, he's a kind of comic, he's a grotesque. More recently, people have argued that actually he knows exactly what he's doing and he's playing these roles and he's kind of riffing off it. But that when he's kind of entertaining people, when he's playing the lyre or whatever, he's doing it because he knows the effect that it will have. And I mean, I actually think that probably he was quite good at the lyre simply because there were pretenders who reappeared after his death claiming to be Nero, and one of the attributes that they had to have was a facility with the lyre.
A sort of Lambert Simnel type figures, but more musical. Here's one for you, I think, really, Will, which from Peter George, who perhaps slightly wearily is engaging with our kind of our insistence on talking about Trump in this session. But he says, if we're going to continue the analogy between Trump and Nero, can we call Mike Pence the Seneca figure in that he tries to round out some of Trump's rougher edges and make him more acceptable to the notion of the Republic? So maybe a way of thinking about that, like, what was Mike Pence's role in the kind of whole Trump arrangement, Will?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, the sort of attempt to kind of normalize or sort of slightly normalize things. I mean, I'm not sure how expertly I can really comment on that. I mean, Pence did obviously have to try to act as a kind of a bridge to, the rest of the kind of constitutional sort of arms of government, and to inject some kind of sort of vague normality into proceedings. Just trying to think. I mean, I'm not hugely invested in this particular analogy beyond some of the kind of comments that Tom's already made, which I think is very interesting to think about the sort of ways in which these echoes are actually kind of by design in some sense. But no, I think it's an interesting point. I mean, it's I mean, the Pence figure is very interesting, and of course, it is also Pence eventually became the target of the mob for reasons that I mentioned earlier, because Pence was the one who eventually kind of accepted that ultimately, Trump would have to leave office, and he was the one who was, working, he was cooperating with the Senate, and and that's why there was this kind of mob which was allegedly seeking to actually string him up as they stormed around Capitol Hill on January the 6th. So, I mean, there's a certain, there's an interesting kind of morality tale surrounding Pence throughout all of this, and Pence now, actually, because it's a sort of it seems to be a kind of necessary kind of criterion for getting anywhere in the Republican Party now, is sort of now totally back on board with the whole kind of Trump cult, by the sound of things, despite the fact that he was actually targeted by all of this. So, but it's an interesting. Perhaps others might be able to talk about the Seneca analogy more.
Well, actually, what I'd like to do is just quickly ask you one other quick question, Will, and then I'm going to ask you all a very good question, which has come from the audience, which cuts to the whole point. So Fiona Benson asks, does Nero's popularity necessarily make Nero a populist? So, Will, could you talk to this, where does popularity end and populism begin?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Again, populism is a term associated with modern liberal democracies which run elections, and that certain people are criticised for seeking to kind of circumvent the normal ways of winning by finding some other channels, often involving the media, often involving their own private money, such as Trump, often maybe using Facebook, whatever it might be. That on some level, popularity has been kind of instrument, also been sort of weaponized, if you like, in order to kind of win by sort of unfair means. I think that in a political system which is not a mass democracy, the term populism obviously can't really be used in the same way, because it loses all of those sorts of implications. I mean, popularity obviously. Yes, I think that popularity, at least popular recognition, popular renown in some way, matters greatly to populists. This is why, there's endless debates about whether someone from the British National Party, when Nick Griffin went on Question Time, hosted by the BBC, whenever that was, about 15 years ago or so, that was an incredibly controversial issue. Because although Nick Griffin's ideas, the then leader of the British National Party, might be very offensive to the vast majority of people, it granted him the first step towards popularity, which is at least being kind of popularly recognised in a sense. So the idea is that you should sort of remove the oxygen of publicity from figures if they are considered to be beyond the pale. So popularity and democracy obviously have a kind of complicated relationship.
Thank you, Will. That was really nicely put. Okay, I have this is my last question, and I'm going to do a quick fire round to all of you. And it's from Anonymous, another anonymous attendee. Ultimately, do you personally think Nero is deserving of his reputation as a tyrant? Catherine.
Oh, I find it very difficult, really, because I'm afraid I feel that what I study is the myth, really, rather than the man, and I'm not sure we can really get at the man. I'm interested in the whole sort of set of discourses around representing emperors, and kind of how we then kind of weigh them on the scales, if you like, to determine whether they're truly tyrants or not. I mean, what kind of definition of tyrant do we want to use? I'm swearing.
Typical professor of history.
Sorry.
Right. Will, now that you've dipped your toe into the world,
I'm on a very steep learning curve when it comes to Nero, I'm afraid. I mean, I think I've been to the Fabulous exhibition, and I've been trying to learn what I can as I go along. I mean, I'm just trying to think what the precise definition of a tyrant is, and I suppose one would associate it with someone who uses fear and uses power and uses violence in a way that is kind of clearly disproportionate, is used in order to sow fear, and that has a kind of an erratic nature to it, if you like. I mean, all of the stories I've heard so far suggest someone who may have been extremely comfortable with violence, though I suspect that wasn't unique in those in that respect. But in each case there was something quite sort of strategic about it. I mean, I don't know whether others could comment whether he actually had a kind of a love of violence or a sort of celebration of violence, and I think that's perhaps one of the questions that question invite. I mean, how we define a tyrant is the big question.
Yeah, nice guess out, Tom.
Well, I think that our moral standards over the course of the past 2,000 years have evolved so profoundly. They are so utterly different from those that govern the Roman world that by our standards, I think any Caesar would be regarded as a kind of monstrous figure. I mean, of course, Nero is the real Nero is almost impossible to get hold of, but he was clear. I'm happy to say I think he was clearly an appalling man. No matter how much the senators and the Christians, whatever, might be, he clearly did terrible things. But having said that, he was awful, but I quite like him.
Brilliant. Well, on that cheery note, I think we must draw things to a conclusion. I think we've learned that populism is a useful, if limited, ultimately, lens through which to see Nero. And I hope that we have drawn out some kind of interesting things to think about or think with in relation to Nero. And the exhibition continues until the 24th of October, not until next week, as I erroneously, I think, said at the beginning of this event. The exhibition continues until the 24th of October. And if you haven't seen it, I urge you to do so. It is absolutely fascinating. And there are things that are so beautifully displayed and just a huge amount to look at. So I highly recommend it. And I would now like to thank our panelists again. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Tom. And thank you to everybody who attended distantly but close to us online this British Museum event. Thank you very much and goodbye.